I am Maya, 35 years old, and until last Christmas, my family thought I was nothing more than a cautionary tale. We were sitting around my parents' immaculate dining table in Atlanta when my mother clinked her crystal glass and smirked, announcing they had finally sold Grandma Ruby's historic estate. She looked right at me and said I was never in the will anyway. My sister laughed, adding it was a good thing since I would just waste the money on my little debts. I calmly took a sip of my cabernet, locked eyes with them, and told them I hoped they enjoyed the cash, considering I was the luxury developer who just bought it. The silence that followed was absolute. Before I reveal what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our pristine six-bedroom house in Buckhead, love was a currency I never had enough in my account to afford. My parents, Corinne and Vernon, operated our family like an exclusive country club, where my older sister Jasmine held a lifetime VIP membership, and I was the help they begrudgingly kept on payroll. My mother was obsessed with status, spending her days maintaining her image among the black elite of Atlanta, hosting charity luncheons, and making sure everyone knew how perfect her bloodline was. Jasmine fit right into that mold, beautiful, compliant, and perfectly willing to let our parents control her life, as long as they funded her lavish lifestyle. I was the dark horse, the daughter who asked too many questions, who refused to major in what they wanted, and who ultimately became the designated scapegoat for every family inconvenience. That Christmas Eve dinner was designed to be another masterclass in my humiliation. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, smelling of honey-baked ham, collard greens, and the heavy, expensive perfume my mother wore like armor. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table nursing my wine while Jasmine held court. She was sitting next to her husband, Trevor. Trevor was a slick, fast-talking white real estate broker who always acted like marrying into our family was his personal philanthropic achievement. My father, Vernon, hung on his every word, treating Trevor with the kind of immediate respect and financial trust he completely withheld from his own black daughter. Halfway through the main course, my mother picked up her silver spoon and tapped it sharply against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound commanded immediate silence, a gesture she had perfected over decades of hosting society galas. She stood up, smoothing down her tailored silk dress, her eyes sweeping the table before landing directly on me with a predatory gleam. "I have some wonderful news to share," Corinne announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Vernon and I have finally finalized the sale of Grandma Ruby's property in the West End. We closed the deal this morning with a highly exclusive luxury developer. The neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly, and frankly, it was time to let that old decaying house go. It is going to secure our family's financial legacy for generations to come." My chest tightened at the mention of Grandma Ruby. She was the only person in this family who ever saw me, who ever truly loved me without conditions. To hear my mother dismiss her historic, beautiful home as a decaying property to be liquidated for cash made my blood boil, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. Jasmine leaned across the table, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light. She looked at me, her lips curling into a condescending sneer. "It is such a relief," Jasmine said, swirling the champagne in her glass. "But Maya, do not even think about asking Dad for a handout from this sale. I know things have been tight for you, but you need to figure out your own little debts. We are not a charity, and this money is for people who actually know how to build wealth." I looked at my sister, taking in her designer clothes and the smug satisfaction radiating from her pores. She was running a failing lifestyle beauty brand that our parents were quietly keeping afloat, yet she had the audacity to lecture me about wealth. I slowly picked up my wine glass, taking a deliberate, agonizingly slow sip of the cabernet. I let the silence stretch, letting their arrogance fill the room to the brim before I decided to shatter it entirely. "That is incredibly sound advice, Jasmine," I said, my voice steady and deadly calm. "You absolutely should hold on to every single penny of that cash. I hope you and Trevor enjoy the payout, considering I am the anonymous luxury developer who just bought the property." The air was immediately sucked out of the room. The silence was so profound you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My mother's triumphant smile froze, then slowly melted into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. "Do not be ridiculous," Corinne scoffed, her voice cracking like a whip. She slammed her hands down on the table, leaning forward. "You buy a $2.5 million estate in the West End. You could not even afford to keep your busted Honda Civic from being repossessed when you were 22 years old. You came crying to us, and we let them tow it away to teach you a lesson about financial responsibility. You expect us to believe you have millions of dollars sitting in a bank account." Her words were meant to cut, but they only reminded me of the fire that forged me. I remembered standing in the freezing rain at 22 watching my car get towed because I had to choose between paying my tuition or making my car payment. I had called my parents begging for a $200 loan, promising to pay them back with interest. They refused, telling me I needed to learn the hard way, while the very next day they bought Trevor a vintage Rolex for his birthday. They let me walk miles to my night shifts in the bitter cold just to prove a point. "I did not need your help. Then Mom and I certainly do not need it now," I replied, my eyes locked on hers. That was when Trevor erupted. He shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the hardwood floor. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, making the fine china rattle and the silverware clink in alarm. His face was flushed crimson, a vein throbbing in his neck as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a pathological liar," Maya Trevor shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "My brokerage handled that sale personally. I vetted the buyer myself. It was a massive corporate holding company out of Delaware. There is absolutely no way you are connected to them. You do not have that kind of capital, and you do not have the brains to pull off a blind trust acquisition. Stop trying to ruin your sister's night just because you are a miserable, broke failure." I just looked at him, feeling a terrifying, absolute calm wash over me. The trap was set, and they had just walked right into it, completely blind to the fact that the woman they were screaming at held every single one of their purse strings. Trevor stood there with his finger pointing right at my face, a blotchy red flush creeping up his neck and bleeding into his pristine white collar. He breathed heavily, completely, ignoring the stunned silence of my parents sitting at the head of the table. He was so incredibly confident in his assessment. He was a man who had spent his entire life failing upward, shielded by my father's money and my sister's blind devotion. He genuinely believed I was just a bitter, broke woman trying to ruin their holiday dinner with a pathetic lie. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached down beside my chair, unzipped my leather tote bag, and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. The room was so quiet that the sound of the heavy parchment paper sliding across the polished mahogany table, brushing past the crystal gravy boat, and the centerpiece sounded like a thunderclap. The envelope stopped right in front of Trevor's plate. He stared at it like it was a live grenade. He looked over at my father Vernon as if asking for permission to engage, but my father was completely frozen, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Trevor snatched the envelope, ripped the flap open, and yanked out the stack of documents. I took my time setting my wine glass down. I watched his eyes scan the top page. I watched the arrogant, mocking light in his eyes dim, flicker, and extinguish entirely. Apex Holdings is not just a random corporate entity. Trevor, I said, my voice steady and cutting through the heavy air of the dining room. It is a private equity firm I established 3 years ago. When your senior partners started looking for a buyout to cover their shrinking margins, my legal team reached out. They were more than happy to take an all-cash offer. We closed the deal last Tuesday morning. Trevor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The paperwork in his hands was shaking slightly. I did not just buy Grandma Ruby's house. I continued leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. I bought your entire boutique brokerage. I own the commercial leases on your office space. I own your client lists. I own the proprietary software you use. And most importantly, I own your employment contract. You work for me now. Jasmine slammed her hands down on the table. Her chair shrieked against the hardwood floor as she shot up her perfect silk holiday dress, twisting around her waist. Her face was contorted with a frantic, ugly kind of panic. She lunged forward, grabbing Trevor's arm, but her eyes were fixed entirely on me, burning with the kind of pure hatred reserved only for a sibling who has finally stopped playing their assigned role. "You are out of your mind!" Jasmine screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You think this makes you look powerful, Maya? You are just trying to humiliate my husband because you are a sad, bitter woman." "Corinne," my mother gasped and pressed a hand to her pearls, playing the offended matriarch, but she did not tell Jasmine to lower her voice. She never did. "Look at you." Jasmine continued, her tone turning venomous, trying to strike at the only insecurities she thought I still had. "You sit in your empty luxury apartments all alone. You have no one. No man has ever wanted to build a life with you, so you have to spend your pathetic life trying to cast a shadow over my marriage. You are just jealous because Trevor actually loves me, and you are entirely unlovable." I looked at my sister. I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist, a gift from our father to celebrate the launch of her lifestyle brand, a brand that had not turned a single dollar of profit in 4 years. I felt absolutely nothing. No sting, no familiar ache of inadequacy. The girl who used to cry in the basement while Jasmine paraded her boyfriends upstairs was long gone. "I did not need a husband, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "I needed peace." I stood up slowly, matching her height across the table. I needed financial security, something I have not had a single day of my life since I was 19 years old. "Do you remember what happened when I was 19? Jasmine? Do you remember me sitting in the university financial aid office sobbing because my tuition check bounced?" Vernon shifted in his chair, his posture stiffening. I looked directly at my father. "I needed peace," I repeated, staring right through his expensive suit, "something I have not had since Dad drained every single penny of my college savings account. He emptied my future to bail your husband out of his first spectacular failure of a tech startup." The dining room descended into a suffocating, heavy silence. My mother looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the cranberry sauce. She had known. They had all known. They had let me take on crippling student loans, let me work 3 jobs until I was physically sick from exhaustion, all to protect Trevor from the consequences of his own incompetence. They had sacrificed my future to buy Jasmine's domestic illusion. But Vernon was a patriarch who equated his worth with absolute authority. He could not stand a woman, especially the daughter he had designated as the family failure, challenging his dominance in his own home. He could not tolerate a black woman holding power over the white son-in-law he had proudly paraded around his country club. Vernon pushed his chair back with a violent shove. He stood up, towering over the table, his face a mask of thunderous, unrestrained fury. He slammed both his hands onto the mahogany wood, leaning toward me with a look that used to send me running for cover when I was a child. "You think buying out your brother-in-law makes you the boss of this family?" Vernon bellowed, the veins in his forehead popping against his dark skin. "You think a few $1,000,000 makes you untouchable? You are nothing but an arrogant, disrespectful child who just made the biggest mistake of her miserable life." I held my ground, lifting my chin. "You just bought a toxic asset, Maya." My father sneered, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across his face. "You did not do your due diligence. Trevor found a massive tax lien hidden on that property. Grandma Ruby owed the government hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now that debt belongs entirely to your little holding company. By January, the feds will seize everything you own, and I will not give you a single dime to save you." My father did not wait for my response. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document, slapping it onto the mahogany table right next to my wineglass. He produced a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen, the exact one my mother had bought him for his 50th birthday, to show off to the deacons at our church. He pointed it at me like a loaded weapon. He ordered me to sign the deed over to the family trust immediately. He claimed he was stepping in to protect me from federal ruin. According to his sudden manufactured narrative, my reckless, unchecked ambition had finally caught up with me, and only his superior financial guidance could save me from the IRS. He used that deep, authoritative tone he reserved for board meetings. and disciplining disobedient children. Sign the paper right now, Maya. Let men who actually understand corporate taxation handle this mess before you drag our pristine family name into a federal investigation and end up in a prison cell. I looked down at the document resting near my plate. It was a standard quitclaim deed hastily printed designed to transfer all rights of Grandma Ruby's historic estate to a trust entirely controlled by Vernon and Corinne. It was a blatant, desperate power grab disguised as paternal protection, and it was almost insulting how stupid they thought I was. I did not touch the pen. I leaned back in my chair, carefully smoothing the linen napkin in my lap. I told him I ran a comprehensive title search, using the top commercial real estate attorneys in Atlanta, before I wired a single cent for that property. I knew exactly what was on that title. There was no federal tax lien. Grandma Ruby paid her property taxes early every single year. She kept the stamped municipal receipts in a fireproof metal box tucked under her bed. I knew that for a fact, because I was the one who drove her to the county building every November to pay them, while the rest of the family was too busy shopping for luxury cars they could not afford. My mother lost whatever polished Southern belle composure she had left. Corinne lunged across the corner of the table, knocking over a crystal water goblet. Her hand shot out, grabbing my forearm with surprising force. Her acrylic nails dug sharply through the sheer fabric of my dress, pinching my skin until it stung. She hissed that I had been a defiant, ungrateful child since the day I was born. She demanded I pick up the pen and sign the paper, screaming that I owed them for putting a roof over my head when I was a struggling teenager. She claimed I was trying to destroy the family out of sheer spite. I looked down at her manicured hand gripping my arm, taking in the diamond rings she polished every morning. Then I locked eyes with her. I yanked my arm out of her grasp so forcefully that she stumbled back against her heavy dining chair, gasping in shock. A roof. Mom, I asked, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. Do you mean the unfinished concrete basement you locked me in during my entire senior year of high school? The one with the exposed fiberglass insulation and the constant flooding problem? You forced me to sleep down there on a cheap, deflating air mattress just so Jasmine could have the entire master suite to host her sorority sisters. You did not put a roof over my head. You put me in storage so you would not have to look at the daughter who did not fit your perfect country club image. Jasmine let out a loud, theatrical gasp, pressing a hand to her chest, as if my words had physically struck her. She immediately started crying, producing those perfectly timed, manipulative tears she had been using to escape accountability since we were in elementary school. She sobbed and leaned into Trevor, crying that I was ruining Christmas, that I was making up vicious lies to hurt her because I was deeply insecure. My father rushed around the table to comfort her, glaring at me like I was a monster. He told me I was sick in the head for bringing up ancient history when he was actively trying to save my future from a tax crisis. The sheer hypocrisy was suffocating. They were standing in a dining room funded by Jasmine's fake lifestyle brand, eating food off fine china, bought with severely maxed out credit cards, trying to steal a $2.5 million estate from the only person in the room who actually worked for a living. They honestly believed their own delusions. They thought they could simply bully me back into submission, back into the quiet, compliant scapegoat who took the blame for every single family failure. But they were dealing with a woman who negotiated ruthless multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions before breakfast. Their intimidation tactics were nothing but a weak, poorly rehearsed performance. Trevor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since I dropped the bomb about buying out his brokerage, suddenly stood up straight. He adjusted his designer suit jacket, a smug, venomous smirk spreading across his pale face. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, tapping the bright screen a few times before holding it up like a trophy. He told me it was too late for me to play the smart, untouchable executive. He proudly announced that he had already filed a preliminary forfeiture notice with the State Department of Revenue using his emergency broker credentials, flagging my LLC for immediate review. He looked me dead in the eye, fully confident in his white male privilege and his position as my father's favorite, and delivered his ultimate threat. If I did not sign that quit-claim deed over to Vernon right that second, he was going to hit send on a secondary automated alert directly to the federal banking authorities. "If you do not sign Maya, your corporate accounts freeze at midnight," Trevor said, his voice dripping with absolute arrogant certainty. "Let us see how powerful you feel when you cannot even buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning." I stared at the glowing screen of Trevor's phone, then looked up at his flushed, triumphant face. He honestly believed he held the winning hand. He stood there puffing out his chest, radiating that specific brand of unearned confidence that my father had always found so deeply impressive. The entire dining room held its collective breath, waiting for me to break. They expected the tears, the apologies, the frantic backpedaling that used to define my existence in this house. Instead, I did not even blink. I slowly reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad. I woke the screen, tapped a single secure application, and turned the device around, sliding it across the mahogany table until it stopped right next to his empty dinner plate. "Take a very close look at that screen, Trevor," I said, keeping my voice soft and perfectly level. On the bright display was a live encrypted banking portal, showing a private offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The status icon in the top right corner blinked a bright, undeniable red, displaying the words "Frozen by order of federal investigation." Trevor looked down. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth opened, but the arrogant threats he had just been shouting died in his throat. I did not give him a chance to recover. I looked around the table and explained exactly what they were looking at. I told them that before I authorized the multi-million-dollar buyout of his boutique brokerage, I had my lead forensic accountant run a deep, unsparing audit of every single file, ledger, and escrow account attached to his name. My team had been inside his systems for weeks. I knew all about the fake tax lien on Grandma Ruby's property long before I ever sat down for this Christmas dinner. It was nothing but a clumsy, desperate smokescreen that Trevor had manufactured. He had been planning to skim the supposed $500,000 tax payment directly off the top of the house sale to pay off massive off-the-books gambling debts he had racked up over the past 3 years. He was trying to steal from his own family to save his kneecaps. The silence in the room shattered. Jasmine let out a confused, high-pitched noise, looking wildly between her husband and the iPad. But it was my father who reacted exactly the way I knew he would. Vernon slammed his hands on the table, his face twisted in denial. He refused to believe it. He stood there, a black man who had spent his entire life desperately seeking the approval of white country club elites, violently defending a white con artist over his own flesh and blood. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice booming with absolute rage. He yelled that I was a pathological liar, that I had forged that screen just to ruin his son-in-law. He said I was doing exactly what I did back in high school when I accused Jasmine of stealing my valedictorian speech. He shouted that I had always been insanely jealous of my beautiful sister, that I had fabricated that story just to ruin her graduation day, and now I was fabricating federal financial crimes just to ruin her marriage. He demanded I apologize to Trevor, immediately wipe that smug look off my face, and sign the quitclaim deed before my bitter jealousy destroyed our family completely. I looked at my father with nothing but profound, heavy pity. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke cut through his shouting like glass. I told him that Jasmine did not just steal my valedictorian speech, she paid the school janitor $50 to unlock my locker so she could physically steal the flash drive right out of my backpack. She did it because she had spent her entire senior year partying and skipping classes while I studied until my eyes bled. I reminded him that I had to write a brand new speech entirely from memory, sitting in the humid bleachers while she stumbled over my stolen words on the auditorium stage. I told him that his desperate, pathetic need for Jasmine to be the perfect golden child was the exact same blind spot that let Trevor rob him blind, right under his nose. He was so eager to have a white son-in-law he could brag about at his golf club that he never bothered to ask why Trevor's business was constantly hemorrhaging cash. Trevor suddenly lunged across the table, his hand outstretched to grab my iPad. I anticipated the move smoothly, pulling the device back and slipping it safely into my bag. He was sweating now, his designer collar stained and damp. He sputtered that I was crazy, that he was calling the police to report me for cybercrimes and corporate espionage. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my gown. I reached into my bag one final time. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents heavily stapled and secured with a rigid red backing. I did not slide these across the table. I tossed them directly into the center of the spread, letting them land with a wet, heavy slap right on top of my mother's prized roasted turkey. Cranberry sauce and gravy splattered across the pristine white tablecloth. My mother shrieked, jumping back to protect her silk dress, but I kept my eyes locked on Jasmine. I told them those were formal, legally binding 24-hour eviction notices. I knew exactly why they were so desperate to get the title to Grandma Ruby's historic house before the new year. They had been using the property as a free, unpermitted commercial warehouse for Jasmine's failed beauty brand. Hundreds of cardboard boxes filled with cheap expired lotions and terrible cosmetics were rotting in the sunroom where my grandmother used to read her Bible. They had turned her sanctuary into a dumping ground for a business that had never made a single dime. I leaned over the ruined dinner table, resting my hands near the soiled documents. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and told her she had until exactly this time tomorrow to get her garbage off my property. I made it crystal clear that my private security team would be arriving at noon. If a single box of her cheap inventory was left inside that house by tomorrow night, I was personally carrying it all out to the front lawn and setting it on fire. I grabbed my coat, turned my back on their stunned open mouths, and walked out the front door into the crisp winter night. The morning air was bitter and sharp, carrying the metallic scent of winter frost, as my black SUV pulled up to the curb in the West End. Grandma Ruby's historic Queen Anne Victorian stood exactly as I remembered it, a towering testament to her hard work, featuring a sweeping wraparound porch and intricate woodwork. But the sanctity of the property was currently being violated. I had given my family 24 hours to clear out their garbage. I should have known they would use that time to attempt a frantic, underhanded coup. Parked illegally across the driveway was an unmarked white commercial van. Standing on the wide front porch, huddled together like thieves in the morning light, were my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law. Trevor was actively leaning against the heavy oak front door, holding a cordless power drill, while a man in a thick canvas jacket kneeled near the deadbolt with a ring of lockpicks. Vernon stood directly behind them, waving his hands and barking orders, clearly trying to bully the hired locksmith into working faster. Corinne was clutching the lapels of her mink coat, shivering and scanning the street, while Jasmine paced back and forth holding a clipboard. They were trying to change the locks before my eviction deadline expired. I did not panic. I did not even feel my heart rate accelerate. I simply tapped the partition glass of my vehicle. The two private security contractors I had hired, Marcus and David, stepped out of the SUV first. They were imposing men professionals dressed in tailored black overcoats, exuding the kind of quiet, absolute authority that money buys. I stepped out behind them, my heels clicking sharply against the frozen pavement. The sound caught Trevor's attention. He dropped his arm, the power drill whirring to a pathetic stop. Vernon spun around, his face instantly contorting into a mask of purple rage. The locksmith, a sensible man who immediately recognized the incoming legal liability, took one look at my security detail, grabbed his tool bag, and bolted past Vernon without saying a single word. He practically sprinted to his van, leaving my family entirely exposed on the porch. "What do you think you are doing here?" Vernon demanded, marching down the wooden steps. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic he had relied on his entire life. "This is private property, Maya. Get back in your car before I have you arrested for trespassing." Marcus and David did not wait for my command. They moved in perfect synchronization, stepping smoothly in front of me and forming an impenetrable human wall between my father and me. Vernon hit the invisible barrier of their presence and stopped dead in his tracks. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, and the realization that he could not physically reach me or scream in my face left him momentarily paralyzed. I stepped slightly to the side, maintaining a safe distance, and held up the heavy brass key that the estate attorney had handed over to me the day before. "This is my property, Vernon," I said, my voice projecting clearly in the quiet morning air. "I gave you 24 hours to remove Jasmine's inventory. Attempting to illegally drill the locks on a home you do not own is a criminal offense. Step away from my front door." Jasmine let out a piercing, theatrical wail. She threw her clipboard onto the porch, the papers scattering across the wooden floorboards. She stomped her expensive boots, her face twisting into a furious, tear-streaked mask. She dropped to her knees on the porch, clutching the porch railing, as if she were a martyr being dragged to the gallows. She screamed that it was her house, that her inventory was vital to her business, and that I was a jealous monster trying to destroy her livelihood. She wailed that Grandma Ruby would be disgusted with me. "Grandma Ruby loved me best." Jasmine sobbed, her voice echoing down the quiet residential street. "She always wanted me to have this house. You are just trying to steal my legacy." I looked down at my older sister, a grown woman, throwing a toddler's tantrum on the frozen wood. I turned to Marcus and David and gave them a curt nod. They immediately bypassed my stunned father, stepped over Jasmine's flailing legs, and unlocked the heavy oak door with my key. They pushed it open and disappeared into the house. I looked back down at my sister. "Grandma loved you, Jasmine," I said, my tone completely flat and devoid of sympathy. "But she knew you were lazy. She watched you quit every job you ever had. She watched Dad fund your failures. That is exactly why she made me promise to change the locks the second she passed. She knew you would turn her beautiful home into a dumping ground." Seconds later, Marcus and David emerged from the house. Each man was carrying 2 massive, heavy cardboard boxes. The sides of the boxes were stamped with the garish pink logo of Jasmine's brand. They walked straight to the edge of the porch and dropped the boxes directly onto the frost-covered front lawn. The cardboard hit the ground with a heavy thud. One of the boxes split open on impact, spilling dozens of cheap plastic bottles across the dying grass. The overpowering, sickly sweet smell of expired vanilla lotion and separating chemicals filled the cold air. My mother shrieked, running down the steps to gather the cheap plastic bottles, her mink coat dragging in the frozen mud. Corinne screamed that I was destroying thousands of dollars in merchandise, begging Vernon to do something to stop me from ruining their golden child's fake empire. Marcus and David simply turned around, marched back into the house, and returned with 4 more boxes, dumping them ruthlessly onto the growing pile on the lawn. Trevor watched his wife weeping over expired lotion, and his father-in-law rendered completely powerless. The arrogant smirk he had worn in the dining room the night before had completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, erratic desperation. He realized he had lost his brokerage. His fake tax lien scheme had failed, and his wife's business was literally being thrown out into the trash. He spun around, his breathing ragged, and marched aggressively toward his oversized, overpriced luxury truck parked in the driveway. He yanked the heavy metal door open and reached behind the driver's seat. When he turned back around, his hands were wrapped tightly around the grip of a solid aluminum baseball bat. His eyes were wild, shifting frantically between me and the massive security guards hauling out the inventory. He raised the bat, his knuckles white, and advanced toward the porch, pointing the metal barrel directly at Marcus's chest. Too late, Trevor spat out, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unhinged pitch. "I already filed the paperwork. You cannot kick us out. This is our property. We have squatters' rights." I stared at the aluminum bat, trembling in Trevor's grip. The morning air was freezing, but beads of sweat were rolling down his temples, dampening his collar. He was terrified, operating purely on adrenaline and a severely bruised ego. Marcus, who was a foot taller and significantly wider than Trevor, merely shifted his weight, his hands remaining loosely clasped in front of him. My security guard looked at the weapon the way a person looks at a mildly annoying insect. I did not raise my voice. I did not back away or flinch. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and dialed 911. I put the call on speaker so the entire porch could hear it ring. The dispatcher answered immediately. I clearly stated my name, my exact address in the West End, and calmly reported that a man was trespassing on my property and actively threatening my private security team with a deadly weapon. Trevor's eyes widened in horror. He lowered the bat slightly, the harsh reality of the situation beginning to pierce through his manic episode. Vernon barked at me to hang up the phone, furiously waving his arms. He hissed that I was airing dirty laundry in public, completely ignoring the fact that his son-in-law was seconds away from committing aggravated assault on a residential street. I gave the dispatcher Trevor's full name and a physical description, then ended the call without another word. We stood in tense, agonizing silence on the frozen lawn. Jasmine stopped crying and scrambled to her feet, hiding behind our mother. Corinne clutched her mink coat tighter, muttering under her breath about the neighborhood watching us. They had spent their entire lives ruthlessly protecting their pristine society image, and now they were about to be caught acting like common criminals on a police dashcam. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder, until two Atlanta Police Department cruisers swung sharply onto the street. Their blue and red lights flashed violently against the facades of the historic homes. The moment the heavy tires hit the curb, Trevor underwent a sickening instant transformation. The unhinged bat-wielding maniac completely vanished. In his place stood a terrified, innocent victim. He hastily lowered the baseball bat, letting it hang loosely by his thigh, and pasted on a look of sheer frantic relief. Two officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Trevor immediately walked toward them, using that slick, familiar tone he always deployed when he needed to leverage his white privilege. He introduced himself, gesturing wildly toward me, Marcus, and David. He told the officers he was just trying to protect his wife and her property from a hostile, unprovoked takeover. He claimed that an aggressive, unstable woman had shown up with two massive hired thugs and started destroying their valuable business inventory. He painted a picture of absolute terror, casting himself as the brave defender of his family against unwarranted, violent hostility. He spoke to the officers like they were guys from his country club, lowering his voice conspiratorially, utterly confident that they would instinctively take his side against a black woman and two large black security guards. I waited for my father to intervene. I waited for the man who had raised me to step forward and tell the police that the man holding the weapon was lying. Instead, Vernon smoothed down his expensive wool coat and walked right up to the officers to perfectly corroborate Trevor's manufactured story. He introduced himself, making sure to drop the name of his prestigious Buckhead neighborhood to establish his own authority and wealth. He looked at the police officers and pointed a rigid finger directly at me. He told them I was his daughter, but that we had been estranged for years. He called me mentally unstable. He claimed I harbored a deep obsessive grudge against my sister and that I had shown up unprovoked to harass them and vandalize their property out of pure jealousy. He completely erased my ownership of the house, my professional success, and my legal rights, choosing to protect Trevor's fragile ego over his own daughter's safety. It was the ultimate betrayal, delivered with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime sacrificing my well-being to maintain his own comfortable illusions. He told the officers I needed to be removed from the premises immediately before I caused any more physical damage to Jasmine's business. The lead officer turned to me, his expression hardening as he approached. He asked me to step away from the security guards and explain exactly what I was doing on the property. I did not argue. I did not yell or get defensive. I simply opened my leather tote bag and pulled out a blue plastic folder. I walked calmly toward the officer, ignoring Trevor's smug, victorious smile and my father's glaring eyes. I handed the folder over. Inside was the original notarized warranty deed, transferring the estate into my name, officially filed and stamped by the county clerk. Behind that was the corporate acquisition paperwork, proving my firm now owned Trevor's brokerage, completely nullifying his claim of any financial authority or superiority. And finally, I included a copy of the 24-hour eviction notice I had legally served them the night before, complete with a verified timestamp. I told the officer that the man holding the baseball bat was my newly acquired employee, and he was currently trespassing on my private property after attempting to illegally drill my locks. The officer reviewed the documents in absolute silence. His partner stepped closer, reading the pristine legal text over his shoulder. The air grew thick and heavy as the absolute truth of the paperwork systematically dismantled every single lie Trevor and Vernon had just spun. The lead officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned slowly on his heel and faced Trevor. The casual, friendly demeanor he had shown seconds prior was completely gone. He unclipped his radio, his hand dropping back down near his holster. He ordered Trevor to drop the baseball bat immediately. Trevor froze, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He stammered, trying to argue about squatters' rights and preliminary forfeiture filings, but the officer cut him off sharply. He repeated the command, his voice echoing loudly across the frost-covered lawn. He informed Trevor that he was trespassing on private property, that his squatter's rights claim was legally baseless nonsense, and that if the bat did not hit the ground in 3 seconds, he would be placed in handcuffs for aggravated assault and criminal trespassing. The metal bat hit the frozen concrete driveway with a sharp, pathetic clatter. Trevor raised his empty hands, stepping back completely humiliated. Vernon stood absolutely frozen, his mouth tightly shut, staring at the ground as the crushing reality of his powerlessness finally shattered his ego. The officers instructed my family to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately, explicitly warning them that if they returned, they would be arrested on the spot. Marcus and David stepped back onto the porch, resuming their unmovable post by the front door. Jasmine sobbed into her hands, completely destroyed as she looked at her ruined inventory. But Corinne did not cry. My mother stepped around my defeated father and walked right up to the property line. She adjusted the collar of her mink coat, her eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. She glared at me with a hatred so pure it practically burned the air between us. "You think you won?" Corinne asked, her voice low and dripping with venom. "I'm the chairwoman of the Heritage Foundation Gala on New Year's Eve. I will stand on that stage and ruin your professional reputation in front of every Black investor in Atlanta." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, taking in the trembling line of her jaw and the absolute venom pooling in her dark eyes. Corinne stood there in her expensive mink coat, the winter wind whipping her perfectly styled hair around her face, entirely convinced that she still held the ultimate power over my life. The Heritage Foundation Gala was the premier social event of the year for Atlanta's Black elite. It was a room filled with generational wealth venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and politicians. For decades, my mother had wielded her position on that board like a royal scepter, deciding who was allowed into the inner circle and who was cast out into social exile. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I closed the distance between us, stopping just inches from the invisible property line separating my estate from the public sidewalk. "I want you to do exactly that, Mom," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I want you to stand up on that grand stage, tap the microphone, and tell every single investor in that ballroom exactly who I am. Tell them your youngest daughter just executed a blind, multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition right under your nose. Tell them I outsmarted your husband, bought out your son-in-law, and legally evicted your golden child. Please give me the free marketing." Corinne's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. She was not used to being challenged, and she was certainly not used to me calling her bluffs. She gripped her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles strained against her leather gloves. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice into a lethal conspiratorial hiss. "You think they will admire you?" Corinne sneered, a cruel light dancing in her eyes. "You think those investors will trust their capital with a woman who has a criminal record? I will not just tell them you are a ruthless sister, Maya. I will pull the sealed precinct files. I will tell the entire board how we had to bail you out of a holding cell. I will remind everyone that beneath your expensive suits and your fake corporate titles, you are nothing but a common convicted thief. Let us see how quickly your private equity firm crumbles when I expose your criminal past to the entire city." For a fraction of a second, the front lawn was completely silent. The 2 police officers were finishing their paperwork by their cruisers out of earshot. Marcus and David stood stoically on the porch. Vernon crossed his arms, nodding in grim agreement with his wife, while Jasmine finally stopped sniffing, a nasty, hopeful smile returning to her tear-stained face. I stared at them, then I laughed. It was not a chuckle or a polite scoff. It was a loud, genuine, bitter laugh that echoed off the frost-covered Victorian homes lining the street. The sound physically startled my father, causing him to take a half-step backward. Corinne's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. My criminal past, I asked, the laughter dying in my throat as I locked eyes with my mother. Are you actually threatening me with the shoplifting charge I took when I was 16 years old? I turned my gaze away from Corinne and looked directly at my older sister. Jasmine's hopeful smile vanished instantly. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost standing in the winter cold. She took a step backward, bumping into the side of Trevor's luxury truck. Let us talk about that criminal record, Mom, I said, raising my voice so it carried clearly across the freezing lawn. Let us tell everyone the absolute truth about what happened at Neiman Marcus 19 years ago. Do you remember that afternoon, Jasmine? You were competing for the Miss Teen Georgia pageant. You had made it to the final round and you were completely obsessed with this vintage sequined silk gown. But Dad had just cut off your credit card because you failed your midterm exams. You were desperate. You told me we were just going to the mall to window shop. Vernon frowned, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. He looked at Corinne, but she refused to meet his eye. She was staring a hole into the frozen mud at her feet. We walked into the designer section. I continued stepping out onto the sidewalk, forcing them to look at me. You grabbed the dress, dragged me into the fitting room, and started crying. You said your entire life would be over if you did not win that crown. And when I turned my back to check my phone, you shoved a $3,000 gown directly into my school backpack. You walked out of the store empty-handed, and the second I stepped through the security sensors, the alarms started screaming. Maya, stop it right now, Corinne ordered, her voice trembling with a sudden frantic desperation. Do not do this in the street. I am doing it right here, I shot back, my voice echoing like a whip. The police handcuffed me in the middle of the mall. They put me in the back of a cruiser. And when you and Mom arrived at the precinct, Mom pulled me into a private corner. Do you remember what you said to me, Corinne? You grabbed me by the shoulders and you begged me to take the fall. You told me that if Jasmine got a criminal record, the pageant board would disqualify her and her entire future would be ruined. You looked your 16-year-old daughter in the eye and said, you do not have anything to lose, Maya. Do this for the family. Vernon's arms dropped to his sides. The authoritative, imposing patriarch completely dissolved. He turned his head slowly, staring at his wife with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. What is she talking about? Corinne Vernon demanded, his voice dangerously low. You told me Maya was acting out. You told me she was caught stealing cheap makeup because she was hanging around a bad crowd. You told me you paid the store manager to keep it quiet. Corinne opened her mouth, stammering, trying to form a coherent sentence, but she was trapped. She looked at Jasmine for help, but Jasmine was pressing her hands over her mouth, visibly hyperventilating. The golden child illusion was shattering right in front of the man who had funded it his entire life. I took the charge, I told my father, watching the reality of his family's deception finally crush his pride. I did 200 hours of community service washing graffiti off city buses. I lost my academic scholarship to my top university because of that misdemeanor on my record. I carried the stigma of being a thief in my own home, and you let me do it, Dad. You believed them because it was easier to view me as a failure than to admit your perfect oldest daughter was a manipulative criminal. Vernon looked physically sick. He looked at Jasmine, taking in her trembling, guilty frame. He realized that for decades his wife and his favorite child had lied to his face to criminalize his youngest daughter. The foundation of his entire worldview was collapsing on a frozen lawn in the West End. Trevor did not care about the emotional devastation unfolding in front of him. He did not care about the shoplifting or the lies. He only cared about the humiliation of being stripped of his power, his money, and his fake prestige. He realized the police were starting to look over again, drawn by the escalating tension. Trevor stepped forward, grabbed Jasmine roughly by the arm, and jerked her toward the passenger side of his truck. He shot a venomous, calculating glare over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory focus. Let her talk! Corinne Trevor hissed, his voice dropping into a raspy, threatening whisper just loud enough for me to hear. Let her have her little moment on the porch. She thinks she has us backed into a corner, but she does not know half of what we are holding. We have the ultimate leverage. Just wait until the gala. Trevor's threat hung in the freezing air long after his oversized truck tore out of the driveway, its tires spinning aggressively on the frost-covered pavement. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner of the historic West End street, taking my father, my mother, and my weeping sister with him. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp, biting wind rustling the dead leaves on the oak trees. I did not shiver. I felt an incredible radiating heat spreading through my chest. Corinne thought a society gala could break me. She thought parading my teenage trauma in front of Atlanta's elite would send me crawling back to the basement. She severely underestimated the woman standing on this lawn. I turned away from the empty street and nodded to Marcus and David. They immediately resumed their work, their faces completely impassive. They moved through the heavy oak front doors of Grandma Ruby's house, systematically dismantling the fragile illusion of Jasmine's business empire. I followed them inside, stepping over the threshold into the grand foyer. The air inside the house was stale, suffocating under the overwhelming artificial stench of cheap lavender and synthetic vanilla. Jasmine had stacked her inventory haphazardly, treating the century-old hardwood floors like a cheap commercial loading dock. I walked through the parlor, watching my security team haul out box after box of unsold, poorly packaged serums and toners. The labels were peeling. The boxes were water-damaged. This was the legacy my parents had mortgaged their souls to protect. They had allowed Trevor to siphon money from this very estate to keep this pathetic vanity project afloat. I instructed David to pile every single box near the curb, making sure the neighborhood saw exactly what kind of garbage the golden child was peddling. While they cleared the main living areas, I made my way toward the back of the house. I walked down the narrow, wainscoted hallway that led to Grandma Ruby's sunroom. This room had always been her private sanctuary. It was a beautiful glass-walled space where she used to sit in her floral armchair, reading her worn leather Bible and tracking her stock dividends in a spiral notebook. She was a woman who understood the quiet power of compound interest long before I ever stepped foot in a corporate boardroom. As I stepped into the sunroom, my perfectly polished heel caught on the edge of the large Persian rug. I looked down, my brow furrowing. The heavy hand-woven rug had been violently shoved aside, bunching up against the baseboards. Beneath it, the original heart pine floorboards were exposed. But they were not pristine. They were deeply gouged and splintered, ringed with fresh, jagged scratch marks. I knelt on the cold floor, running my gloved fingers over the damaged wood. Someone had taken a crowbar to the planks. A sudden, sharp realization clicked into place, recontextualizing the entire morning. Trevor had not brought a locksmith just to change the deadbolt on the front door. The front door was a distraction, a secondary objective in case I showed up. His primary target was right here. He had been desperately trying to rip up the floorboards before his 24-hour eviction window closed. He was not trying to save Jasmine's cheap lotion. He was trying to get into the foundation of the house. I gripped the edge of the loosened floorboard and pulled upward. The wood gave way with a loud groan, revealing a dark, hollow cavity packed with thick insulation. Nestled perfectly between the heavy floor joists was a solid steel mechanical dial safe. The heavy metal box was untouched, firmly bolted to the foundation. Trevor had run out of time. He had panicked when my SUV rolled up to the curb, abandoning his attempt to breach it. I stared at the cold steel dial. My family had spent the last 2 decades treating Grandma Ruby like a senile old woman who just baked pies and collected knickknacks. They completely ignored her sharp, calculating intellect. But she and I shared a language they never bothered to learn. She knew they would try to pick her bones clean the moment she took her last breath. I reached out, resting my fingers on the cool brass dial. I did not need a locksmith. I closed my eyes and spun the dial to the right. Grandma Ruby had whispered the combination to me on a humid August afternoon, sitting in this exact room. It was not her birthday. It was not her wedding anniversary. It was the exact date I had been accepted into my advanced university finance program. It was a day my parents had completely ignored, too busy hosting a celebratory brunch for Trevor, passing his real estate exam on his 3rd attempt. Ruby had handed me a crisp $100 bill, pulled me close, and told me to never let anyone else balance my ledger. She told me to lock my independence away where they could never reach it. I spun the dial to the left, stopping on the second number. I spun it to the right again, landing on the final digit. I grasped the heavy steel handle and pulled down. The internal locking mechanisms clacked loudly, echoing in the empty sunroom. The thick fireproof door swung open on its heavy hinges. The air inside the safe smelled of old paper and stale dust. I reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the meticulously organized columns of numbers and account routing codes. It only took me 5 seconds to recognize the offshore banking structures. The account numbers perfectly matched the frozen Cayman Islands shell companies I had just shown Trevor on my iPad. But these records went back 5 years. Trevor had not just skimmed the tax lien money. He had been secretly routing Vernon's corporate funds through Grandma Ruby's address, using her home as a physical blind spot for a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. He was laundering his stolen cash right beneath my father's feet, and Ruby had tracked every single cent of it. I placed the ledger carefully on the floor beside my knee. My hands were perfectly steady. I reached back into the safe to see if there was anything else. My fingers brushed against a stiff sealed envelope tucked into the very back corner. I pulled it out into the bright morning light pouring through the sunroom windows. Across the front of the pristine white envelope, written in Grandma Ruby's elegant looping cursive, was my name. Below my name was a date stamped just 3 weeks before she died. I slid my perfectly manicured fingernail under the flap, tearing the paper cleanly. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy watermarked parchment paper. The heading across the top was unmistakable. It was a handwritten, fully executed last will and testament, superseding the outdated document my father had aggressively pushed through probate. I lowered my eyes to the first line of the document. I read the words once. I read them a second time. My breath hitched sharply in my throat, a sudden jagged gasp escaping my lips, as the true magnitude of what she had done crashed over me. Trevor and Vernon thought they were fighting me for control of a single property. They had absolutely no idea that the game had just fundamentally, permanently changed. 3 days after I pulled Grandma Ruby's true handwritten last will and testament from the hidden floor safe, the city of Atlanta was completely consumed by the arrival of New Year's Eve. The Heritage Foundation Gala was not merely a charity dinner. It was the ultimate battleground for social supremacy among the Black elite. Fortunes were made, reputations were destroyed, and bloodlines were aggressively validated under the glittering crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. For an entire decade, my mother Corinne had ruled this specific ecosystem with an iron fist. As the chairwoman of the foundation, she controlled the seating chart, the guest list, and the narrative. She had promised to use this exact stage to publicly execute my professional reputation. I decided to give her a front row seat to her own funeral. I arrived at the luxury downtown hotel just as the valet line was thick with imported sports cars and stretched limousines. I stepped out of my vehicle wearing a custom floor-length emerald silk gown. I did not wear flashy jewelry. I did not need to. The knowledge of the offshore routing numbers and the absolute legal supremacy of Ruby's hidden will rested in my mind like a loaded weapon. I walked up the grand marble staircase toward the ballroom entrance, my posture perfect, my expression completely unreadable. Corinne was waiting right at the double doors. She was draped in heavy silver sequins, surrounded by a flock of sycophantic board members and local politicians. The moment her eyes locked onto my emerald gown, her fake, practiced smile twitched violently. She excused herself from the group, her movements sharp and predatory, and intercepted me before I could even hand my coat to the cloakroom attendant. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through the silk of my dress. "What do you think you are doing here?" Corinne hissed, keeping her voice low so the surrounding photographers would not catch the venom in her tone. "You are not on the VIP guest list, Maya. I made absolutely sure of it." I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. "I bought a platinum ticket through a corporate proxy," I replied smoothly, adjusting the sleeve of my gown. It is a public charity event, Mother. You cannot legally turn away a paying donor. Corinne's eyes narrowed into dark, furious slits. She looked around the crowded foyer, realizing that causing a physical scene at the door would ruin her perfect, highly publicized night. She signaled sharply to the head maitre d', a nervous-looking man holding a digital seating tablet. "If you insist on being here, you will sit exactly where I put you," Corinne whispered, stepping closer so I could smell the sharp tang of her expensive perfume. "You are not going to parade around this ballroom trying to poach my investors or spread your lies. You belong in the back, where no one has to look at you." She snapped her fingers, instructing the maitre d' to escort me to table 89. She turned her back on me immediately, pasting her radiant, artificial smile back onto her face as a local news anchor approached her for an interview. I followed the maitre d' across the massive ballroom. We walked past the front tables adorned with towering white floral centerpieces, past the middle section, filled with minor politicians and local celebrities, all the way to the very back edge of the room. Table 89 was shoved into a dark, drafty alcove directly next to the heavy, swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. The table was small, the lighting was terrible, and the constant deafening clatter of waiters rushing in and out with heavy trays of food made conversation nearly impossible. It was a table specifically designed for social exiles. It was meant to be a profound, humiliating punishment. I pulled out my own chair, smoothed the back of my emerald gown, and calmly sat down. I reached for the crystal pitcher in the center of the table and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. A waiter burst through the kitchen doors, nearly clipping my shoulder with a massive tray of appetizers, but I did not even blink. I took a slow sip of water, letting the chaotic noise wash over me. Sitting in this dark, noisy corner, I felt a sudden, vivid flash of memory. The overwhelming clatter of the kitchen faded, replaced by the echoing acoustics of the First Baptist Church. I was 9 years old. It was the Sunday morning of Jasmine's baptism. Our parents had invited the entire congregation, throwing a massive catered reception in the church hall. I had spent hours that morning trying to braid my thick, natural hair, proud of the neat rows I had managed to create all by myself. But when I walked downstairs, Corinne had taken one look at me and recoiled in absolute horror. She dragged me into the bathroom and tried to forcefully comb through my tight coils, furious that I had not allowed her to chemically relax my hair like Jasmine's. When she could not make my hair lay perfectly straight to fit her rigid country club standards of acceptability. She grabbed my arm, marched me to the church sanctuary, and forced me to sit in the very last pew near the vestibule doors. She told me my hair wasn't done right. She told me I looked messy and unkempt, and she absolutely refused to let me sit in the front row with the rest of the family for the photographs. I had spent that entire Sunday morning sitting alone in the back row, crying silently, while my parents paraded Jasmine around the altar in a pristine white lace dress. I had felt so much intense, suffocating shame back then. I had genuinely believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that I was inherently flawed and unworthy of being seen by the people who were supposed to love me. Now, sitting in the shadows of the most exclusive gala in the city, I felt absolutely no shame. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical clarity. Corinne was still operating under the pathetic delusion that physical placement dictated power. She actually thought putting me in a dark corner near the kitchen would somehow diminish my worth and silence my voice. She did not understand that I owned the board. A loud chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the beginning of the formal program. The heavy murmur of the crowd died down as the stage lights flared to life. Corinne strutted up to the podium, basking in the applause, her silver dress catching the spotlight. She tapped the microphone, her voice echoing confidently through the massive sound system. She welcomed the guests, thanked the sponsors, and then announced the evening's highly anticipated keynote speaker. "It is my absolute honor to introduce a man who needs no introduction," Corinne beamed, her voice dripping with deep reverence. "He is a pioneer in global venture capital, a billionaire philanthropist, and the founder of Sterling Holdings. Please welcome Mr. Elias Sterling." The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. From the side entrance, Elias Sterling stepped into the room. He was a striking, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, exuding the kind of quiet, effortless power that commanded instant respect. Corinne immediately stepped down from the stage, rushing forward with her hand outstretched, desperate to be the first to greet him, to physically guide him to the head table, where Vernon and Trevor were eagerly waiting to pitch their failing businesses. Elias Sterling walked down the center aisle. He saw Corinne rushing toward him. He saw her eager outstretched hand, and he completely ignored her. He did not even break his stride. He walked right past the chairwoman of the Heritage Foundation as if she were completely invisible. A shocked murmur rippled through the front tables. Corinne froze, her hand still suspended in the air, her perfect smile slipping into an expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. Elias continued walking. He bypassed the head table. He bypassed the wealthy investors in the middle section. He navigated through the sea of bewildered, incredibly wealthy guests, walking all the way to the very back edge of the ballroom. He stopped directly in front of the swinging kitchen doors. He looked down at table 89, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his face. Maya, Elias said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the room. He extended his hand across the table. I received the updated financials on the brokerage acquisition. Absolutely brilliant work. May I sit with you? Elias Sterling settled into the flimsy banquet chair across from me, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was sitting in the darkest, draftiest corner of the grand ballroom. The relentless clatter of the catering kitchen behind us seemed to mute itself as the collective attention of 500 Atlanta elites shifted away from the brightly lit stage and locked directly onto table 89. The whispering started immediately, a low buzzing current of speculation rippling through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. They were all wondering why the most powerful venture capitalist in the room had bypassed the prestigious front tables to sit with the woman Corinne had explicitly banished to the shadows. I smiled, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed as I reached for another glass, pouring sparkling water for Elias. He accepted it with a gracious nod, leaning in slightly to speak under the ambient noise of the room. He told me my financial maneuvering on the brokerage acquisition was the most ruthless, elegantly executed corporate takeover he had seen in a decade. He casually mentioned that my team's forensic accounting was flawless, and he was fully prepared to back my firm's expansion into commercial real estate. I thanked him, my voice steady, but my eyes remained fixed on the stage. Corinne was gripping the sides of the acrylic podium. Her knuckles were stark white. The perfectly practiced, radiant smile she had worn moments ago was now stretched tight, looking more like a grimace. She had engineered this seating arrangement to humiliate me, to render me invisible to men exactly like Elias Sterling. Instead, by attempting to isolate me, she had inadvertently turned my table into the center of gravity for the entire gala. She took a sharp, jagged breath, realizing she was losing control of the room. She tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thumps echoing through the massive sound system, forcefully dragging the audience's attention back to the front. Welcome, distinguished guests. Corinne began, her voice ringing out with an artificial, practiced warmth. Tonight, the Heritage Foundation gathers to celebrate not just the legacy of our ancestors, but the vibrant, limitless future of our community. We are here to invest in the next generation of innovators, creators, and leaders. I sat back in my chair watching my mother weave a masterful web of philanthropic buzzwords. She spoke passionately about economic empowerment, about lifting up local entrepreneurs, and about the foundation's sacred duty to distribute wealth where it would make the most profound impact. It was a spectacular performance. If I did not know the absolute truth about her, I might have actually believed she cared about the community. But I knew exactly what this speech was building toward. Every year, the Heritage Foundation awarded a massive community grant to a promising local business. It was the crown jewel of the gala, a highly publicized philanthropic gesture meant to solidify the board's benevolent image. This year, our board reviewed hundreds of applications from brilliant, hardworking individuals. Corinne announced, her voice rising to a dramatic crescendo. But one business stood out above the rest. One entrepreneur demonstrated unparalleled vision, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to Black female excellence. It is my profound honor to announce that this year's $250,000 community grant goes to a revolutionary lifestyle brand poised to change the beauty industry. Corinne paused for theatrical effect, extending her arm toward the front row. Please join me in congratulating the founder and CEO of Luminous by Jasmine, Jasmine Wilson. The ballroom erupted into polite programmed applause. From the front table, Jasmine let out a perfectly timed, completely manufactured gasp of shock. She pressed her hands over her mouth, playing the role of the overwhelmed, deeply humbled recipient. Trevor wrapped his arm around her waist, beaming with artificial pride as he kissed her cheek. Vernon stood up and applauded enthusiastically, acting as if this was a glorious, unexpected triumph for his eldest daughter. Jasmine stood smoothing down her glittering silver gown and began her slow, triumphant walk up the steps to the main stage. I did not clap. I slowly reached into my beaded clutch and pulled out my smartphone. Watching Jasmine walk up to receive $250,000 in charity funds, a cold, heavy memory anchored itself in my chest. I was 22 years old, fresh out of my university finance program, with a brilliant business plan for my first independent consulting firm. I had found the perfect modest commercial lease to start my business. I just needed a small influx of capital to secure the deposit. I had spent days preparing a comprehensive presentation, complete with market research and projected profit margins. I brought it to my parents, sitting in my father's dark walnut study, formally pitching them for a $5,000 loan. I promised to pay it back with interest within 6 months. I remembered the look on Corinne's face. She had laughed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that cut straight to my bones. Vernon had shaken his head, refusing to even look at my meticulously prepared documents. Corinne had looked down at me from across the mahogany desk and told me that my little business idea was a pipe dream. She told me to go find a stable entry-level job in a cubicle somewhere. When I told them this was my only chance to build something real, Corinne had sneered. She told me they did not run a charity. She told me I needed to learn how the real world worked. 2 days later, they bought Jasmine a brand new luxury SUV simply because she complained her old car was the wrong shade of white. They did not run a charity when their youngest daughter needed $5,000 to build a legitimate career. Yet here they were, standing under the bright lights of the grand ballroom, actively orchestrating a massive $250,000 embezzlement scheme. They were using a literal charity to funnel tax-free donor money directly into Jasmine's failing, bankrupt beauty brand. They were stealing from the community to subsidize a vanity project that consisted of nothing but boxes of expired, rotting lotion sitting on Grandma Ruby's front lawn. I unlocked my phone, navigating to a secure messaging thread connected directly to Zoe, my lead IT specialist, and the private security contractors waiting in the hotel's control room. On stage, 2 foundation board members carried out a massive, oversized novelty check with Jasmine's name printed in bold black letters. Corinne positioned herself perfectly in the center of the stage, pulling Jasmine into a tight, photogenic embrace. Trevor and Vernon walked up to join them, forming the ultimate picture-perfect portrait of a successful, thriving family. The event, photographers rushed the stage, their cameras raised, preparing to capture the exact moment Corinne handed over the $250,000 prize. I looked down at my phone. I typed a single one-word command: execute. I hit send and placed the phone face down on the table. Corinne smiled radiantly, reaching out to grasp the edge of the oversized check. She opened her mouth to deliver her final self-congratulatory remark to the flashing cameras. But before her fingers could even touch the cardboard, the massive 30-foot digital projector screen stretching across the wall directly behind the stage suddenly flickered. The soft, ambient holding graphic of the Heritage Foundation logo, violently distorted, tearing into jagged lines of static before the screen glitched entirely to black. The pitch-black screen behind my mother suddenly hummed with a deep electric surge. A brilliant white light flooded the stage, casting stark, unforgiving shadows across Corinne, Vernon, Jasmine, and Trevor. Instead of the Heritage Foundation logo returning to the display, a massive high-definition financial flowchart illuminated the entire 30-foot wall. Bright, undeniable red arrows connected the foundation's private charity accounts directly to Trevor's boutique real estate brokerage, tracing a complex but glaringly obvious web of money laundering. The routing numbers on the screen perfectly matched the offshore Cayman Islands accounts I had found inside Grandma Ruby's hidden floor safe. At the bottom of the chart, bold black text detailed 3 years of staggering, unauthorized wire transfers sent directly from Trevor's holding companies to major Las Vegas casinos. A collective gasp violently sucked the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. 500 of Atlanta's wealthiest, most powerful figures stared at the screen, their crystal champagne glasses frozen in mid-air. The elite venture capitalists, the politicians, and the generational donors collectively realized they were looking at a masterclass in corporate fraud funded entirely by their philanthropic donations. I stood up from table 89. Elias Sterling remained seated beside me, leaning back in his flimsy banquet chair with a look of profound, quiet satisfaction. He knew exactly what I was about to do. I did not rush. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with absolute deliberate precision, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown sweeping gracefully across the carpet. The crowd parted for me, instinctively stepping aside as if I were a reigning monarch reclaiming her throne. I felt the heavy weight of 100 stairs, but my eyes remained locked completely on the stage. I ascended the velvet-lined stairs. Corinne was completely paralyzed. The oversized novelty check slipped from her manicured fingers, hitting the polished wooden floor with a hollow, echoing thud. Her mouth hung open, her eyes darting frantically between the damning numbers projected on the massive screen and my approaching figure. She was the untouchable chairwoman, the undisputed queen of Atlanta society, and she was currently suffocating under the crushing weight of her own systemic, meticulously documented fraud. I stepped right up to the acrylic podium. Corinne's hands were shaking so violently that the microphone stand rattled against the plastic. I did not ask for permission. I did not hesitate. I reached out and slid the microphone smoothly from her trembling grip. She let it go without a single ounce of resistance, her arms falling limply to her sides. I turned to face the vast sea of stunned faces, my voice projecting through the massive sound system with crystal clarity. "Good evening, distinguished guests," I said, maintaining a perfectly level, unwavering tone. As you can clearly see on the audited financial flowchart behind me, the Heritage Foundation has been operating as a private slush fund for my family's vanity projects and personal debts. But this community deserves the actual investment it was promised tonight. Therefore, I am personally pledging a donation of $500,000 directly to the West End Youth Center. A murmur of shock rippled through the front tables, but I raised my hand to command absolute silence. However, this donation comes with one non-negotiable condition. I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room. The Heritage Foundation's books must be immediately frozen, and every single board member must submit to a full federal forensic audit. Before the reality of my words could fully settle over the audience, heavy, frantic footsteps thundered across the wooden stage. Vernon lunged from the shadows of the stage wing, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He abandoned any pretense of upper-class dignity, scrambling toward the podium with his large arms outstretched, desperately reaching for the thick audio cables connecting the microphone to the sound system. He wanted to plunge the room into silence. He wanted to physically tear the truth away from the audience. "You disrespectful brat!" Vernon bellowed, his voice raw and booming even without amplification. He grabbed the thick black cables, yanking them violently in a pathetic attempt to pull the plug. "Always ruining your sister's moment." He honestly believed he could still play that card. He believed he could invoke the same tired, pathetic narrative he had used my entire life to shield his golden child from the consequences of her own actions. He was willing to publicly humiliate himself to protect a hollow illusion. I took a step back, maintaining my iron grip on the microphone, and pitched my voice over the growing chaos in the ballroom. "A moment funded by embezzlement," I announced, my voice dominating the massive room. "The grant money you are cheering for is not an investment in Black female excellence. It is being funneled directly through Trevor's brokerage to pay off his massive gambling debts. You are applauding a felony." The entire ballroom dissolved into absolute, unrestrained pandemonium. Chairs scraped violently against the floorboards as powerful investors stood up, shouting furious demands for an immediate explanation. Corporate sponsors frantically pulled out their phones to dial their legal teams. Jasmine stood frozen over the dropped novelty check, her hands clutching the sides of her head, sobbing hysterically, as the elite society she desperately worshipped watched her fake empire burn to the ground. Trevor lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. The slick, charming facade he wore to manipulate my father was completely obliterated. He lunged across the stage, his face a mottled purple spit flying from his lips as he charged directly at me. He pointed a frantic, shaking finger at the 30-foot screen, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who knew he was caught. "She forged those documents." Trevor screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he tried to close the distance between us. "I will sue you for everything." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the sweating, panicked man who had tried to steal my grandmother's legacy and smiled. It was a cold, absolute smile of finality. I raised the microphone slightly, ensuring that every single person in the room would hear my final words. "Check your phone, Trevor," I said softly. "The SEC just raided your office." Trevor's momentum halted as if he had slammed headfirst into an invisible sheet of bulletproof glass. Two massive hotel security guards, previously stationed in the shadows of the stage stairs, immediately flanked him. They seized his arms, pinning him back before his polished dress shoes could take another step toward me. In the sudden suffocating quiet of the ballroom, a sharp, incessant vibration echoed from Trevor's tailored breast pocket. His phone was buzzing. It did not stop. It rang, vibrated, and chimed in a frantic, overlapping sequence of high-priority emergency alerts. Trevor wrenched his right arm free from the guard's grip, just enough to dig frantically into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out the device. I watched his arrogant, entitled expression completely collapse in real time. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickening shade of ash gray. The screen displayed dozens of missed calls from his junior partners, frantic capitalized text messages from his legal counsel, and automated alerts from federal agencies, officially freezing his corporate accounts. The SEC raid was not a strategic bluff. It was a surgical, devastating strike timed perfectly with the zenith of his public triumph. Trevor dropped the phone. It clattered against the polished wooden stage floor, sliding slightly toward the edge. He did not even try to pick it up. He simply stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute terror. He had built his entire identity on manipulating other people's money, wearing expensive watches and flashing fake investment portfolios. Now standing under the bright stage lights, he had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Below the stage, the fallout was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely merciless. The 500 elite guests of the Heritage Foundation Gala did not offer sympathy. They offered immediate, ruthless self-preservation. The room became a hive of frantic whispers and aggressive movements. I watched the mayor of Atlanta aggressively gesture to his chief of staff, making a swift, highly calculated exit toward the side doors to avoid any photographic association with the unfolding scandal. Major corporate sponsors, the men and women who had written five-figure checks simply to secure front-row tables, were already on their cell phones, loudly instructing their wealth managers to halt all pending donations to the foundation. Elias Sterling stood up from table 89. He did not rush. He simply buttoned his immaculate tuxedo jacket, offered me a brief, deeply approving nod across the vast expanse of the chaotic ballroom, and walked out the main entrance. He was taking his billions, his influence, and his ultimate stamp of approval with him, and everyone else in the room followed his lead. The physical turning of backs was a synchronized, devastating wave. Corinne and Vernon were experiencing a live public execution of their social standing. Corinne finally broke. The impenetrable diamond-hard facade she had worn for 3 decades shattered into a million jagged pieces. She fell heavily to her knees next to the dropped novelty check, her heavy silver sequined gown pooling around her like a discarded theater costume. She covered her face with her shaking hands, sobbing with loud, ugly, heaving gasps. It was not the elegant practice crying she typically used to manipulate church congregations or country club committees. It was raw, desperate, unfiltered panic. "Maya," Corinne wailed, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with tear-streaked makeup running down her cheeks. "You destroyed us. You destroyed everything. We had a pristine reputation in this community. We were respected. We were the standard. How could you do this to your own family? I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to erase me. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the solid, undeniable weight of cold, hard truth. Your reputation was a glass house built on my back, I replied, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone I still held firmly in my hand. I just threw the first stone. I looked at her sobbing figure and remembered the decades of systematic exploitation. I remembered every single holiday, every society dinner, and every family portrait where she had actively hidden me away, treating my presence as a stain on her perfect canvas. She had spent years cultivating an image of flawless upper-crust perfection, funding her designer wardrobe, Vernon's extensive country club fees, and Jasmine's entirely subsidized extravagant lifestyle by siphoning off my grandfather's initial trust and bleeding Grandma Ruby's hidden assets dry. They had used my silence and my compliance as the very foundation for their empire. They had relied on my programmed obedience to maintain their grand illusion of wealth. Corinne had actively traded my self-esteem for her social currency, deciding early on that I was an acceptable casualty for their collective success. I was the designated scapegoat, the necessary, quiet shadow that allowed their golden child to shine brilliantly in the foreground. But shadows hold the deepest secrets, and I had just exposed every single one of theirs to the glaring, unforgiving light of day. Vernon stepped forward, his heavy footsteps thudding against the stage. He realized that Corinne's emotional breakdown was rapidly sealing their fate. He needed to salvage whatever tiny scraps of credibility remained in the room. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to channel the authoritative, commanding presence he usually wielded in corporate boardrooms. He snatched the microphone directly from my hand. I let him take it. I did not need it anymore. The massive screen behind us was still glowing brightly with the undeniable financial evidence of their crimes. "Please, everyone, please listen to me," Vernon shouted into the microphone, his voice booming with forced, desperate conviction. The guests who were aggressively walking toward the exits paused, turning back with morbid, fascinated curiosity. "My family is a victim here. We are victims of a rogue, deeply manipulative individual. We had absolutely no idea about these offshore routing numbers or these disgusting gambling debts." Vernon turned his body, pointing a rigid, accusing finger directly at Trevor, who was still pinned securely by the security guards. "Trevor acted entirely alone," Vernon declared, throwing his chosen favored son-in-law completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He abused his trusted position as Jasmine's husband. He used her beautiful, innocent lifestyle brand as a deceptive cover for his own criminal activities. We trusted him, and he deceived us all. The Heritage Foundation will fully cooperate with the authorities to ensure this criminal pays for what he has done to this charity, to this community, and to my daughter. Trevor thrashed against the security guards, his eyes bulging with absolute fury at Vernon's sudden, ruthless betrayal. But Trevor could not speak. The sheer shock of the federal raid, combined with the sudden agonizing public sacrifice, had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. He could only stare at Vernon with a look of murderous betrayal. However, Jasmine was not paralyzed. Jasmine had spent her entire life being protected, pampered, and shielded from every single consequence. She had relied heavily on Trevor to fund her luxurious illusion, and she had relied on Vernon to clean up all of her professional messes. Seeing her father publicly, instantly sacrifice her husband to save his own skin shattered her fragile, coddled reality. She realized in that exact moment that Vernon would undoubtedly abandon her next if it meant saving his precious social standing and staying out of federal prison. Jasmine scrambled across the stage floor, her expensive silver gown tearing at the hem as her heels caught on the fabric. She lunged forward, her hands clawing desperately at the heavy microphone stand Vernon had just placed down on the podium. She gripped the cold metal pole, pulling the microphone violently toward her face. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths. Her flawless camera-ready makeup was completely destroyed by her frantic tears. "Trevor didn't do it alone," Jasmine shouted, her voice echoing with a shrill, hysterical pitch that bounced violently off the crystal chandeliers and rang in the ears of every single elite guest in the ballroom. The entire room gasped in unison. The ambient whispering completely stopped. 500 pairs of eyes widened in absolute captivated shock as the golden child finally cracked. "Dad approved the transfers," Jasmine screamed into the microphone, extending her shaking arm to point directly at Vernon's chest. "He signed the holding company authorizations. He knew exactly where the grant money was going." Vernon froze. The first business day of the new year arrived with a sharp, biting frost, but inside my downtown penthouse office, the climate was meticulously controlled. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, framing the city I now quietly owned. The absolute pristine silence of the 54th floor was a stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming, chaotic implosion of the gala just 48 hours prior. I sat behind my custom white marble desk, reviewing the final closing documents for the Sterling Holdings expansion. My mind was completely clear. The heavy glass doors to my executive suite violently swung open, shattering the morning tranquility. My executive assistant, David, was physically shoved backward as Vernon barged into the room. David immediately reached inside his tailored jacket, his eyes locking onto mine for the silent authorization to physically remove the intruder. I raised a single finger, signaling David to stand down and shut the door. Vernon looked pathetic. The imposing, flawless patriarch of the Wilson family was entirely gone. His face was mottled and flushed with high blood pressure. He wore a rumpled charcoal suit that looked as though he had slept in it, the silk tie hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar. This was a drastic, humiliating departure from his usual immaculate country club tailoring. He marched across the vast expanse of my office, his heavy leather shoes thudding aggressively against the hardwood floor. He placed both hands flat on my pristine marble desk, leaning over to cast a dark shadow across my workspace. He was desperately trying to project the formidable, terrifying dominance he had wielded over me since childhood. He ordered me to call the federal investigators immediately. His voice was a harsh, gravelly bark, trembling with unfiltered panic. He demanded that I contact the SEC and retract every single statement I had given them. He insisted that I needed to tell the authorities I was confused, that the offshore routing numbers were a misunderstanding, or that I had acted out of malicious familial spite. He slammed his fist against the marble, demanding that we circle the wagons, hire a unified legal defense team, and keep this entire disaster strictly within the family. He ranted that the media was already camped outside their estate, that his country club associates were ignoring his calls, and that I had a fundamental duty to fix the very nightmare I had created. I did not close my laptop. I did not flinch. I did not even look up from the complex spreadsheet illuminated on my screen. I continued typing, the crisp, rhythmic clacking of my keyboard slicing through his heavy, desperate breathing. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting him completely exhaust his frantic energy. Vernon struck the desk again, harder this time, causing my coffee cup to rattle in its saucer. He roared that I owed him absolute obedience. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and stale, spitting the words at me. He declared that a daughter does not publicly humiliate her father, that a child does not destroy a generational legacy built on his sweat and sacrifice. He told me I was obligated to obey his commands and clean up this mess because he was the head of the family. My fingers finally paused on the keyboard. I slowly lifted my head and met his furious, bloodshot eyes. My expression was perfectly blank. I asked him if he meant the exact same kind of obedience he demanded when I was 20 years old. Vernon blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden shift in conversation. He tried to speak, to bulldoze over my words, but I stood up from my leather executive chair. I matched his height, planting my hands firmly on my side of the marble desk. I reminded him of a humid, sweltering August afternoon 12 years ago. I reminded him of how his wealthiest, most influential golf buddy had drunkenly run a red light and crashed his heavy luxury sedan directly into the driver's side of my compact car. I vividly recounted sitting in the emergency room with a fractured wrist, bruised ribs, and thousands of dollars in impending medical debt. Vernon had not asked if I was okay. He had stormed into my tiny, cramped apartment the very next morning, completely bypassing asking about my physical pain. He had explicitly ordered me to drop the police charges and immediately withdraw the insurance claim. He had looked me right in the eye standing in my cheap apartment and told me that suing his powerful friend would absolutely jeopardize his chances of becoming the golf club president. My physical safety, my lingering trauma, and my financial ruin meant absolutely nothing compared to his social climbing. I told Vernon, keeping my voice dangerously quiet, that my obedience to him had completely permanently expired on that exact day. Vernon's jaw locked. The color drained from his face as the realization hit him. His patriarchal intimidation tactics, the very tools he had used to control my mother and my sister for decades, were completely and utterly useless against me. He had no leverage. He had no authority. He was just a terrified, desperate old man standing in an office he could never afford. His expression shifted from rage to a dark, calculating malice. If he could not bully me into submission, he would resort to outright extortion. Vernon reached inside his rumpled suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder and slammed it down directly on top of my laptop keyboard. He leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a dark, menacing whisper. He told me that Trevor had not come home after the gala. He told me that Trevor had been sitting in a federal interrogation room for the past 48 hours, desperately trying to cut a plea deal with the SEC and the FBI. Vernon smiled. It was a desperate, ugly, terrifying expression. He tapped his thick finger violently against the manila folder. He informed me that Trevor was ready to testify under oath that I had orchestrated the entire $250,000 fraud using my own corporate LLC. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite swung open for a second time, answering Vernon's threat before I even had the chance to speak. Trevor strode into the room, effectively shattering the quiet sanctuary of my office. He looked physically exhausted, his skin pale and lined with deep purple shadows from 48 hours of federal interrogation, but his posture was completely rigid, with an unearned, aggressive arrogance. He was flanked by a tall, impeccably dressed man carrying a monogrammed leather briefcase. The man radiated the slick, overly polished energy of a high-priced, cutthroat corporate defense attorney. Vernon immediately stepped back from my marble desk, a triumphant, malicious sneer spreading across his flushed face. He crossed his arms over his chest, clearly believing that the arrival of this legal cavalry marked the definitive end of my brief rebellion. Trevor did not wait for an invitation. He walked directly to the seating area, dropping his weight into one of my imported leather guest chairs. He crossed his legs, resting his ankle on his knee, trying desperately to project the image of a man completely in control of his destiny. His lawyer remained standing, placing his heavy briefcase on the polished glass of my conference table with a sharp, authoritative click. I did not acknowledge the manila folder Vernon had slammed onto my keyboard. I simply closed my laptop. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit skirt, and walked deliberately across the spacious office toward my private espresso bar. I picked up a delicate porcelain cup, my hands perfectly steady, and pressed the button on the machine. The rich, dark scent of roasted coffee beans began to fill the sterile air of the executive suite. Watching Trevor sit in my chair exuding that deeply ingrained toxic entitlement, a vivid, infuriating memory flashed through my mind. I watched the dark espresso pour into the cup, but my mind was 10 years in the past. It was the week Trevor and Jasmine had officially gotten engaged. Trevor had moved into the family mansion, bringing only 3 cardboard boxes of personal belongings and a brand new, aggressively leased Porsche sports car. At the time, I was working 80-hour weeks to launch my first consulting firm, temporarily living in the guest room to save capital. I had a designated parking spot in the secure enclosed family garage. I drove a practical 5-year-old sedan that I had paid for entirely in cash. The very first morning, Trevor woke up in our home. He walked into the kitchen, tossed his keys onto the counter, and demanded that I hand over my garage clicker. He completely bypassed a simple request and moved straight into a rigid command. He stated that his luxury sports car required strict climate control, whereas my cheap sedan could easily weather the harsh Georgia elements. I had immediately looked to my parents, expecting them to correct his astonishing audacity. Instead, Corinne had told me to stop being difficult and ordered me to move my car to the street. Vernon had nodded in agreement, stating that Trevor represented the new elevated standard of the family and that I needed to make accommodations for our guest. I had spent the next 6 months parking 3 blocks away in the pouring rain, soaking my cheap business suits before every client meeting simply because my parents prioritized the comfort of a manipulative white con artist over the basic dignity of their own black daughter. That exact same unshakable audacity was sitting in my office right now, attempting to steal my livelihood for a second time. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the heat radiate through my chest. I turned around, leaning casually against the edge of the espresso bar, and looked directly at Trevor. "Let us hear the brilliant plan, Trevor," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "Tell me exactly how you plan to orchestrate federal perjury without ending up in a maximum security penitentiary." Trevor's lawyer stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. "My name is Richard Vance," he announced, using a deep, theatrical baritone designed to intimidate opposing counsel. "I represent Trevor in all ongoing federal inquiries. The situation is quite simple, Maya. The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently building a massive racketeering and embezzlement case regarding the Heritage Foundation funds. As of this morning, we have drafted a comprehensive sworn testimony that firmly positions your corporate LLC as the primary architect of the entire offshore routing scheme." Trevor grinned, revealing his perfectly veneered teeth. "We have digital timestamps, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have fabricated emails that look incredibly authentic. We are fully prepared to hand this testimony directly to the federal prosecutors. We will drag your holding company, your offshore accounts, and your brand new partnership with Elias Sterling into a multi-year, highly publicized federal investigation. Your reputation in the financial sector will be completely obliterated before the trial even begins." Richard Vance rested his hands on his leather briefcase. "However, my client is willing to offer a generous alternative. Trevor will tear up the sworn statement. He will take a heavily negotiated plea deal for a minor regulatory misdemeanor, and he will keep your name entirely out of the federal probe. He will take the fall for a simple accounting error." "And what is the price for this remarkable sacrifice?" I asked, taking another calm sip of my coffee. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You will immediately sign over the deed to Grandma Ruby's West End property, transferring full unencumbered ownership directly to me," he demanded, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. "And you will wire a $2 million settlement into a secure, untraceable account by the close of business today to cover my legal fees and outstanding debts. You sign the papers, you pay the toll, and you get to keep your precious reputation. Keep this in the family, Maya. It is just business." The silence in the office was absolute. Vernon stood in the corner, nodding his head in profound approval. He honestly believed they had backed me into an inescapable, flawless legal corner. They thought they were holding a loaded gun directly to the temple of my career. I walked slowly back to my desk. I set my coffee cup down on the marble surface with a sharp, echoing clink. I did not look at Vernon. I did not look at Trevor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Richard Vance. I reached down and unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a thick black leather-bound legal binder. It was incredibly heavy, packed with hundreds of pages of meticulously indexed documents. I placed it on the marble and slid it smoothly across the desk. It glided over the polished stone and came to a complete perfect stop exactly 1 inch from Richard Vance's manicured hands. "Before you officially commit subornation of perjury and facilitate federal extortion, Mr. Vance, I highly recommend you read the very first page of that binder," I said softly. Richard Vance frowned, clearly annoyed by my lack of panic. He reached out, flipped open the heavy leather cover, and began to read the top document. I watched the color completely, violently drain from the lawyer's face. His eyes darted wildly across the text, scanning the dense legal paragraphs. His hands, previously resting with supreme confidence on the desk, began to tremble uncontrollably. He swallowed hard, a visible panicked gulping motion that made his Adam's apple bob against his tight collar. The document was not a threat. It was a fully executed, signed, and federally sealed immunity agreement granted by the United States Department of Justice, officially listing me as the primary cooperating witness and confidential informant in the ongoing RICO investigation against Trevor's brokerage. I had handed the FBI the offshore routing numbers 3 weeks ago. Richard Vance abruptly slammed the binder shut. He scrambled backward, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. He snatched his monogrammed briefcase off the conference table, frantically snapping the brass locks shut with trembling fingers. "What are you doing?" Trevor demanded, standing up from the leather chair, his confident smirk instantly dissolving into utter confusion. "Richard, what does it say? Tell her we are filing the statement." Richard Vance did not look at Trevor. He looked at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. He clutched his briefcase to his chest like a physical shield. "I cannot represent you, Trevor," the lawyer stammered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its theatrical baritone. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately. Do not ever contact my firm again." Without waiting for a single word of response, Richard Vance turned on his heel and practically ran toward the heavy glass doors, fleeing my executive suite, as if the building were actively collapsing around him. Trevor stood utterly alone in the center of the room. The heavy glass doors had barely swung shut behind his fleeing attorney, yet the silence left in Richard Vance's wake was absolute and suffocating. Trevor stared at the closed doors, then slowly turned his gaze down to the black leather binder resting on my desk. His manicured hands twitched against his sides. The smug, invincible armor he had worn into my penthouse was actively cracking, revealing the panicked, hollow fraud underneath. "What is in that binder?" Maya Trevor demanded. His voice dropped an octave, desperately trying to simulate the threatening authority he had lost the moment Vance ran for the elevators. "What did you show him?" I did not hand the binder to him. I left it resting exactly where his lawyer had abandoned it. I looked at Trevor with a profound clinical sense of pity. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee from the porcelain carafe on my desk, letting the rich, dark aroma fill the sterile air of the executive suite. I told him he was so entirely focused on trying to intimidate me with fabricated emails and empty threats that he had completely forgotten the golden rule of corporate finance. When a company is drowning in toxic debt and facing federal scrutiny, it becomes incredibly cheap to acquire. "I bought your brokerage firm, Trevor," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "I used a subsidiary of Sterling Holdings to purchase your entire operation for pennies on the dollar exactly 48 hours ago. I own your servers. I own your liabilities. I own every single internal communication deleted file and offshore wire transfer record your office ever generated. You cannot frame a holding company when the owner of that holding company now legally possesses all of your raw, unedited server data." Vernon stepped out of the shadows near the leather guest chairs, his face twisting into an ugly mask of denial. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me, refusing to accept the reality of the shifting power dynamic. "You are bluffing!" Vernon barked, his voice loud, but entirely lacking its usual terrifying resonance. "You do not have the liquid capital to acquire a federal brokerage firm. This is another one of your pathetic, manipulative games. You are trying to scare us into backing down." I did not argue with him. Arguing with Vernon was a useless, exhausting exercise I had permanently abandoned. I simply reached across my desk and tapped a sequence of keys on my laptop. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my penthouse instantly darkened. The breathtaking, transparent view of the Atlanta skyline was completely replaced by a stark, opaque gray surface. A hidden projector hummed to life above us, casting a massive high-definition image directly onto the frosted glass. It was an email chain blown up to 10 feet tall, featuring Trevor's personal corporate address, communicating with a notorious high-risk offshore lending group. "I am not bluffing, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I stepped out from behind my desk to stand beside the projected image. "Look at the screen. Read the attachments. Look at the routing numbers." Vernon squinted at the massive projection. I watched his eyes track the lines of text. I watched his brain slowly process the aggressive financial terminology he knew so intimately well. "Trevor did not just embezzle cash from the Heritage Foundation charity," I explained, pacing slowly across the hardwood floor, letting my heels click rhythmically against the silence. When his casino debts got too high and the stolen grant money was not enough to cover the massive margins, he needed a huge influx of untraceable liquid cash. So he leveraged your assets. He took out a secret, highly predatory second mortgage on your primary home to cover his gambling losses. Vernon's mouth fell open. He walked slowly toward the glass wall, his hands reaching out as if he could physically pull the damning emails down from the screen. The exact property address of his sprawling gated estate in Buckhead was listed in bold black ink. The interest rates attached to the loan were astronomical, specifically designed by the shadow lenders to ensure an immediate catastrophic default. The loan had already matured, and the default clauses were explicitly clear. "My house." Vernon whispered, his voice completely devoid of air, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen him display. "My estate. Your estate is currently the legal property of the Caymans Lending Group." I corrected him, offering no sympathy. "They are filing the official foreclosure notices as we speak. You have absolutely nothing left. You are completely bankrupt." Vernon staggered backward. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into one of the leather guest chairs, his hands gripping his chest as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The invincible patriarch, the man who had demanded my absolute obedience just 10 minutes ago, was reduced to a hyperventilating broken shell. Trevor watched Vernon fall. He saw the reality of the situation settling heavily over the room. He realized that Vernon could no longer protect him. He realized that I held the absolute power to send him to a federal penitentiary for decades. Trevor began to physically back away, his polished shoes sliding against the hardwood as he retreated toward the glass doors in sheer cowardice. "I did not do this alone," Trevor shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. He pointed a frantic, shaking finger at the screen, then pointed directly at Vernon's slumped figure. "I needed a co-signer for the estate. Jasmine signed the papers. She authorized the second mortgage. She is just as guilty as I am." Before the echo of Trevor's cowardly accusation could fully fade into the chilled, conditioned air of the penthouse, the heavy glass doors violently burst open. Jasmine stood in the threshold, hyperventilating. Her oversized designer sunglasses were clutched so tightly in her fist that the frames were bending, and her usually immaculate camera-ready face was twisted into a mask of pure, devastating horror. She had bypassed the security desk downstairs. She had been standing in the private hallway, listening to every single word through the cracked door. She did not hesitate. Jasmine launched herself across the massive expanse of the office, charging directly at her husband. She slammed her fists into Trevor's chest, her heavy diamond rings catching and tearing the fine fabric of his tailored suit. She beat against him with a wild, unrestrained fury, screaming at the top of her lungs, abandoning every ounce of the refined social grace she had been taught to project. "You ruined my life!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat as she struck him again and again, pushing him backward against the frosted glass wall. "You told me those were standard foundation tax documents. You told me I was signing routine charity disclosures for the gala. You set me up. You pinned your disgusting, pathetic fraud on me so you could gamble away my inheritance." Trevor frantically grabbed her wrists, trying to push her away. His own face was contorted with panic as he desperately tried to shield himself from her relentless physical assault. The polished, picture-perfect power couple of Atlanta high society was currently engaged in a pathetic, violent, crying brawl in the middle of my corporate office. Right on cue, Corinne rushed through the open doors. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor as she rushed into the room. She did not even glance at Vernon, who was still slumped in the guest chair, clutching his chest and staring vacantly at the projected emails detailing his utter financial ruin. She did not look at me, the daughter who actually owned the building she was currently standing inside. Her laser focus was, as always, entirely dedicated to saving and soothing her golden child. Corinne grabbed Jasmine by the shoulders, physically pulling her away from Trevor's battered chest. She wrapped her arms tightly around her sobbing, hysterical daughter, stroking her hair and shushing her with a practiced, entirely blind devotion. She was completely immune to the absolute destruction surrounding them, focusing only on shielding Jasmine from the harsh light of reality. "It is going to be okay, my sweet girl," Corinne cooed, completely ignoring the massive federal crimes and the absolute bankruptcy actively destroying her family. Do not listen to him. We will fix this. We will hire the best defense team in the country. We will use Grandma Ruby's inheritance to clear your name and buy your freedom. We will make this all go away. We will protect you. I stood silently behind my marble desk, watching the scene unfold with a profound sense of absolute closure. Corinne was still operating under the delusion that she possessed a hidden safety net. She still believed that she could simply throw my grandmother's generational wealth at her problems to shield Jasmine from the consequences of her own entitled ignorance. Corinne honestly believed she could buy her way out of federal indictment using the very assets I had spent months securing. I reached slowly under the heavy marble desk. My fingers brushed against the cold, rusted metal I had placed there earlier that morning. I grabbed the thick iron handle and hauled the heavy object upward, feeling the satisfying weight of the iron strain my muscles. I hoisted the vintage heavy iron lockbox onto the pristine surface of my desk. It landed with a massive echoing thud that instantly silenced the screaming and sobbing in the room. The box was heavily weathered, covered in decades of dust and deep scratches, but the distinctive brass latch was completely undeniable. It was the exact lockbox I had meticulously pulled from beneath the floorboards of Grandma Ruby's historic West End home. Corinne froze. The soothing words died in her throat. Her eyes locked onto the iron box, her mouth dropping open as all the remaining blood rushed from her face. She recognized it instantly. She knew exactly what it was, and she knew exactly what its presence on my desk meant for her future. I rested my hands flat on the rusted lid, leaning forward slightly, and looked directly into my mother's terrified, widening eyes. What inheritance, Mom? Corinne's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. She released Jasmine, her manicured claws scraping against the desk as she lunged forward, desperately reaching for the rusted iron box. That belongs to me, she shrieked, her voice stripping away decades of practiced country club elocution. As the eldest daughter, I am the sole executor of that estate. Give it to me immediately. Before her fingers could even graze the oxidized metal, David stepped seamlessly out of the shadows. He moved with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a trained professional, wrapping his massive hand around Corinne's wrist and twisting it just enough to halt her momentum. He forced her back a step, keeping a rigid, impenetrable barrier between my mother and my desk. Corinne thrashed against his grip, her composure entirely obliterated. My mother left that house to me, she spat, her face twisting into a venomous, ugly snarl as she struggled against the security guard. She hated you. She always knew you were a difficult, ungrateful brat who only cared about yourself. I ignored her thrashing. I leaned over the heavy lockbox, my fingers tracing the cold brass dials of the vintage combination lock. I turned the dials with deliberate, agonizing slowness, letting the heavy metallic clicks echo through the penthouse. I knew the numbers by heart. They were the exact date of the day my grandfather passed away, the day Grandma Ruby realized she was entirely alone in a house full of vultures. I looked up at Corinne as the latch disengaged with a heavy, satisfying snap. No, Mom, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Grandma hated fake people. That is exactly why she left this. I pushed the heavy iron lid back. It groaned loudly in protest, exposing the faded velvet-lined interior. I did not pull out a stack of bearer bonds or a hidden paper deed. I reached inside and retrieved a single, sleek silver flash drive. I turned to my laptop, plugging the drive directly into the USB port. I bypassed my standard presentation software and routed the video file directly to the penthouse projection system. The massive frosted glass wall behind me flickered completely, replacing the damning predatory email chain with a high-definition video notarized recording. The pixelated static cleared. Grandma Ruby's face filled the 10-foot glass wall. She was sitting in her favorite floral armchair, wearing her immaculate Sunday pearls, looking exactly as she had 3 weeks before she passed. The sheer shock of seeing her face larger than life and crystal clear paralyzed every single person in the room. Corinne stopped fighting David's grip, her mouth hanging open. Vernon stopped hyperventilating, his eyes fixed on the screen. Jasmine clamped her hands over her face, terrified of the ghost staring down at them. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Then Grandma Ruby's voice filled the room, amplified by the state-of-the-art surround sound system. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I am recording this statement under the strict advisement of my legal counsel," Ruby announced, staring directly into the camera lens with a piercing, unwavering intensity. "If you are watching this, it means my daughter Corinne is actively attempting to steal what does not belong to her." Corinne let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Ruby did not stop. She systematically dismantled the carefully constructed illusions of everyone standing in my office. She looked into the camera and verbally eviscerated Corinne's pathetic, shallow obsession with social status, calling her a hollow shell of a woman who valued designer labels over her own flesh and blood. She tore into Vernon's toxic, fragile pride, labeling him a financial parasite who used a booming voice and a tailored suit to hide his staggering incompetence. She dismissed Jasmine as a lazy, pampered liability who had never worked a single honest day in her entire miserable life. But Ruby saved the sharpest, most devastating blade for last. "I know exactly what you did, Corinne," Ruby stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I know you stole the $10,000 from Maya's college savings account." The room sucked in a collective, horrified breath. Vernon whipped his head around to stare at his wife, genuine shock registering on his face for the first time. Ruby continued, delivering the fatal blow. "I know you drained her account to quietly pay for Jasmine's private abortion clinic bills, and I know you spent the next 5 years aggressively framing Maya as a reckless, irresponsible teenager who blew her own tuition money on partying. You entirely destroyed your youngest daughter's reputation within this family simply to protect your golden child's fake, pristine purity." Jasmine buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Corinne shook her head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over again, completely trapped by the truth she had buried decades ago. Ruby leaned forward in the video. "You thought you fooled me, Corinne. But you are a terrible liar. And because you are a terrible liar, I am making my final intentions perfectly clear. I did not leave the historic West End house to Corinne. I left it to the only person in this family with an ounce of actual sense. Maya." The video did not end there. Ruby adjusted her posture in the floral armchair, a cold, deeply satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. "But I did not just leave her the real estate," Ruby continued, her voice echoing mercilessly off the marble floors. 10 years ago, when Maya was working 3 jobs and sleeping in her car because you kicked her out of the house, I saw her potential. I saw the fire that you desperately tried to extinguish. I went to the bank, liquidated my oldest stock portfolios, and I secretly gifted Maya the $50,000 she needed as seed money to start her first real estate holding company. The family hierarchy shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. Vernon gripped his chest, his breath hitching as the devastating reality hit him. His mother-in-law, the woman whose wealth he had eagerly anticipated inheriting to cover his own massive financial failures, had known he was a fraud the entire time. She had completely bypassed his supposed financial expertise and quietly funded his scapegoated daughter instead. Corinne stared blankly at the frosted glass, completely catatonic. Her entire social standing, her decades of manipulating the narrative, her carefully cultivated image of maternal superiority, it was all an elaborate, pathetic lie, and her own mother had spent the last decade secretly laughing at her. Jasmine slumped against the glass door, realizing she possessed absolutely zero safety net. There was no secret trust fund. There was no magical inheritance coming to bail out her criminal husband or fund her luxury lifestyle brand. Ruby's master will displayed in stark black and white text next to her video feed explicitly disinherited Corinne, Vernon, and Jasmine entirely. They were completely, irrevocably destitute. In the corner of the room, Trevor realized the execution was final. He saw that the money was gone, the house was gone, and his extortion leverage was entirely vaporized. He turned slowly, keeping his back to the wall, and tried to quietly inch his way toward the heavy glass exit doors. He wanted to slip into the hallway and vanish before the authorities realized he was in the building. I reached across my desk, grabbed the ringing cell phone he had dropped on the gala stage 2 nights ago, and hurled it across the room. The heavy device hit him squarely in the chest, clattering to the floor at his feet. Answer it, Trevor, I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated air of the penthouse. It is the feds. Far below us, 54 stories down on the bustling Atlanta streets, the unmistakable wail of police sirens began to echo. The sound drifted faintly at first, then amplified into a piercing, relentless chorus of emergency vehicles surrounding the base of the corporate high-rise. The blinking light on Trevor's dropped phone flashed frantically, a silent confirmation of the doom rising rapidly through the elevator shafts. The realization that federal agents were currently swarming the lobby completely broke the final fragile threads holding my family together. The elegant, sophisticated Wilson family instantly devolved into a pack of cornered rabid animals. Vernon turned on Corinne, his face purple with rage, screaming that her blind, idiotic coddling of Jasmine had brought a federal criminal into their home. Corinne screamed right back, violently shoving Vernon away, blaming his weak, pathetic business acumen for forcing Trevor to seek out predatory shadowlenders in the first place. Jasmine crawled away from both of them, shrieking hysterically, beating her fists against the hardwood floor, screaming that they were all toxic, that they had forced her to marry for money, and that they had completely ruined her life. I stood perfectly still behind my marble desk. The deafening chaos of their screaming match washed over me, but it did not touch me. I did not feel a single drop of anxiety, fear, or regret. I looked at the four people who had spent exactly 35 years trying to break my spirit, erase my achievements, and force me into submission. They were tearing each other apart, completely consumed by the very greed and vanity they had worshipped their entire lives. You all thought I was the scapegoat, I said, my voice completely steady, easily cutting through their chaotic, weeping arguments. I was never the scapegoat. I was just the mirror showing you exactly what you are. A soft, melodic chime echoed through the penthouse. The private executive elevator had reached the 54th floor. The heavy metal doors slid open with a smooth, mechanical hum. A dozen men and women wearing tactical vests, dark windbreakers, and federal badges stepped out into the pristine hallway, their heavy boots moving with synchronized, terrifying purpose. They flanked the glass doors of my office. I did not wait to watch them snap the handcuffs onto Trevor's wrists. I did not stay to watch Vernon weep as his Miranda rights were read aloud. I turned my back on the screaming, completely shattered remnants of my family, walked slowly toward the corner of my office, and looked out the window at the sprawling, magnificent city I had just conquered. The federal authorities moved with a swift, merciless efficiency that completely shattered the final remnants of the Wilson family's manufactured reality. I did not watch them parade Trevor out of the lobby in handcuffs. I did not need to. The local and national news networks handled that broadcast for me, running the footage on a continuous, inescapable loop. The fallout was absolute, and the legal consequences were an avalanche that wiped their slate completely clean. Trevor was formally indicted on 34 counts of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. Without the shield of my holding company to hide behind, and with the full weight of the SEC's forensic audit crashing down upon his shoddy bookkeeping, his high-priced defense strategy immediately evaporated. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a convenient, quiet plea deal. They made an example out of him. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy, who had confidently demanded a $2 million extortion payment in my office, was now sitting in a federal holding facility, trading his custom-tailored Italian suits for an oversized standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The financial sector blacklisted him permanently. His offshore accounts were entirely seized, liquidated to pay back the charities and investors he had systematically defrauded. The collateral damage of Trevor's collapse hit Corinne and Vernon with devastating precision. They had built their entire kingdom on the assumption that their primary residence was an untouchable fortress. But the shadow lenders holding the predatory second mortgage did not care about Vernon's former country club status or Corinne's pristine societal reputation. They only cared about their astronomical interest rates. The foreclosure process was swift and entirely unsympathetic. Within 45 days, the bank officially seized the sprawling gated estate in Buckhead. I received the court dockets detailing their eviction. Vernon, A man who had spent 3 decades commanding boardrooms and demanding absolute obedience was forced to stand on his manicured front lawn and watch burly repossession agents haul his antique furniture into moving trucks. Corinne's vast collection of designer gowns, the armor she used to assert her dominance over Atlanta high society, was unceremoniously shoved into cheap cardboard boxes. Their bank accounts were frozen by the IRS to satisfy the outstanding tax penalties linked to the fraudulent charity grants. They had absolutely zero liquid capital. They were forced to vacate the affluent suburbs and sign a lease for a cramped, heavily outdated one-bedroom apartment in a run-down, forgotten industrial district on the far south side of the city. Corinne, the former undisputed queen of the charity gala circuit, was now cooking cheap meals on a coil electric stove, her designer shoes gathering dust in a tiny mold-smelling closet. Vernon spent his days sitting on a sagging second-hand sofa, staring at a blank television screen, completely stripped of his power, his influence, and his voice. Jasmine's descent was perhaps the most public and humiliating spectacle of them all. With Trevor incarcerated and her parents financially ruined, her entirely subsidized luxurious lifestyle brand evaporated overnight. The vendors she had stiffed came calling. The credit card companies canceled her platinum accounts. She had no actual business acumen, no work ethic, and absolutely no safety net to catch her fall. 6 months after the federal raid, a former colleague sent me a photograph taken inside a fast fashion retail store at a discount strip mall. The image captured Jasmine standing behind the cash register. She was wearing a cheap synthetic uniform polo shirt, her posture slumped with defeat. The photograph caught her in the exact moment she recognized a former country club acquaintance walking through the automatic sliding doors. Jasmine had instantly pulled the brim of her store-issued visor down over her face, physically shrinking behind the barcode scanner, terrified and deeply humiliated by the reality of ringing up clearance rack clothing for the very women she used to mock at private brunches. I looked at that photograph and felt a profound, settling calm. I deleted the image and permanently blocked the sender. I realized then that absolute silence was the greatest, most devastating revenge I could have ever exacted. For 35 years I had believed I was their designated scapegoat. I believed my purpose was to absorb their cruelty. But the truth was far simpler. I was their fundamental financial life support. I was the silent, sturdy pillar holding up their entire glass house. I did not have to orchestrate a complex, malicious plot to destroy them. I did not have to ruin their lives. I just had to step out of the way. I simply had to stop offering my back for them to stand on. Once I removed my invisible support, gravity did all the heavy lifting. They had destroyed themselves with their own unchecked vanity, greed, and toxic pride. I was just the mirror that finally forced them to look at their true reflections. Springtime arrived in Atlanta, washing the city in a vibrant, blooming warmth. The harsh, biting frost of the winter was entirely gone, replaced by the sweet scent of magnolia and dogwood trees. I stood on the newly reinforced, beautifully restored wraparound porch of Grandma Ruby's historic West End house. The property was completely transformed. The peeling paint had been stripped and replaced with a brilliant, crisp white. The sagging roof was fully repaired, and the overgrown yard was now a meticulously landscaped garden. Bolted securely to the brick pillar next to the front door was a gleaming, polished brass plaque. It read, "The Ruby West End Entrepreneurship Center." I had utilized the massive influx of capital from the Sterling Holdings acquisition and Grandma Ruby's secret seed money to fulfill her ultimate legacy. I had converted the sprawling historic home into a fully funded state-of-the-art business incubator. It was specifically designed to provide robust seed capital, elite legal counsel, and comprehensive mentorship to young, brilliant Black female founders who lacked generational wealth or family support. The grand parlor where Corinne used to host her pretentious exclusionary teas was now a collaborative workspace filled with drafting tables, high-speed servers, and a dozen incredibly driven women actively building their own empires. I spent my days walking through those halls, offering the exact kind of fierce advocacy and unwavering belief that my parents had actively denied me. I was rewriting my family history brick by brick, ensuring that the wealth Grandma Ruby had hoarded away was finally being used to uplift rather than to oppress. The sun began its slow descent below the tree line, painting the Georgia sky in brilliant streaks of violet and burnt orange. The incubator had closed for the evening. The young founders had gone home, leaving the property wrapped in a warm, peaceful tranquility. I walked out onto the back porch and sank into a plush, oversized wicker chair. I reached toward the small, glass-topped patio table beside me. I uncorked a bottle of an incredibly rare, highly allocated vintage red wine I had purchased to celebrate the official launch of the center. I poured the dark, rich liquid into a heavy crystal glass, watching it catch the final fading rays of the sunset. Beside the wine bottle, my phone screen suddenly illuminated, breaking the twilight shadows. A text message banner appeared on the locked screen. It was from Corinne. "Maya, please." The message read, the text lacking any of her former aristocratic demands. "We have nothing. The electricity bill is past due. Your father will not get out of bed. Can you just help us with groceries, please?" I stared at the glowing letters. 5 years ago, a message like that would have triggered a massive, suffocating wave of programmed guilt. I would have instantly transferred thousands of dollars, desperately hoping that my financial rescue would finally earn me a single ounce of genuine maternal love. I would have set myself on fire just to keep them warm. I scanned my chest, waiting for the familiar heavy ache of obligation to rise in my throat. I waited for the anger, the bitterness, or the petty satisfaction of watching my mother beg. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely, beautifully dry. There was no anger left to process. There was no lingering attachment. They were simply strangers who shared my DNA, living with the direct, undeniable consequences of their own lifelong cruelty. I picked up the phone. I did not type a response. I did not demand an apology. I did not offer a lecture on accountability. I simply navigated to her contact profile and pressed the red button labeled Block Caller. The screen instantly went black, cutting off her access to my life permanently. I set the phone face down on the glass table. I picked up my crystal glass, feeling the cool, heavy weight of the cut glass in my hand. I leaned back in the wicker chair, lifted the rim to my lips, and took a long, slow sip of the vintage wine. The complex, rich flavor bloomed on my palate. I looked out over the manicured lawn as the sun finally disappeared, leaving the historic property bathed in a soft, comfortable dusk. I smiled, letting out a deep, cleansing breath. The silence was finally entirely and beautifully mine. The greatest lesson from Maya's journey is that true security never comes from seeking validation inside a toxic family. For years, they used her as a stepping stone, mistaking her silence for weakness. But Maya proved that the most devastating revenge is not loud or malicious. It is simply removing the support you secretly provided and letting gravity take over. When you stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm, you reclaim your power. Protect your peace, build your own independence, and let natural consequences handle the rest. Share your story of cutting toxic family ties and subscribe today